I want to welcome everyone who's joining us. If I am not wrong, there are about 12 people joining this session today. Without further ado, let me just say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are participating today from different parts of the globe. And thank you for being here in the first Global Forum on Democratizing Work. It is obviously a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad that that the organizers got this together and that you join us today. Before I introduce the panel and tell you a little bit about the structure, the technical elements of these sessions, and introduce the panelists who have graciously accepted to be here with us. One of them is has been lost, but I'm sure is coming back. I would like to acknowledge that the place where I speak from, Boston, is situated in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts First Nations. I hope you join me in paying respect to the elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates my, and I hope your, commitment to working to dismantle the system of oppression that have displaced indigenous peoples and the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. While by no means an expert, I have posted on the chat some useful references and links for those who would like to have more details. Now, let me welcome you again to this session that has a different title in the program from what we suggested, but the idea is to discuss the democratization of work, especially the issues that concerns with cooperativization and different forms in which this happens. So this panel focuses on some of the problems and issues faced in democratizing work by zooming in on the different institutional and organizational actors and processes involved and some of the dilemmas that need to be addressed in favoring democratization. The panelists present research from Belgium, France, Argentina, and Canada. And as you see shortly, each of them, each of their presentation associates the dilemmas and experimentations of democratization with cooperatives and processes of cooperativization. I want to acknowledge here the long tradition of cooperatives and different forms of associative mutuality and cooperatives type of work elaborated in the 19th century in Europe, and also the tradition of collaboration, cooperatives, and mutuality present in the African continent for centuries, as Dr. Prieto and Dr. Phipps suggested, are also to be found in an unspoken and silenced tradition of African-American management thinking and organizational and community experiences in the United States. And this is a book where they speak about that. And I will post it also on the chat. So this is to recognize that these forms, ideas, and practices in different ways have been with us for a while, and that orthodox form of organizing that we've come to know today as the only way or the best ways are just a portion of our contemporary lives, and that democratization of work, decommodification, and different forms of cooperatives and associative work are ongoing processes with experiences, problems, and issues that change in different institutions and historical conjunctures where they are situated. So our first speaker, and just remember they will be speaking for 15 minutes in total. The questions, please put them on the chat, and then we'll have them at the end where we have a collective Q&A session. So keep your questions for the chat and just input them there, and then we have the discussion at the end. The first speaker, and it is my pleasure to introduce her, is Professor Patrizia Zanoni. She's situated in both the Netherlands and Belgium, as she's a professor of organization studies at Utrecht University School of Governance and also professor at Hasselt University. Professor Zanoni is also co-editor-in-chief of the journal Organization. Her presentation explores social reproduction in the democratization of work, as she looks at organization and institutional experiments that are redrawing the boundaries between unpaid work, the state, and the market. The second speaker, for another 15 minutes in closer session, so there will be no interruption, is Professor Marcelo Vieta. Marcelo is a professor of leadership of education at the University of Toronto. His intervention zooms in on the dilemmas of two different experiences of democratizing work. He focuses on conversions and reappropriations of cooperatives and solidaristic socioeconomic and organizational logics. One is based in Argentina with the experiences of the empresas recuperadas, and the other is based in Canada, where cooperativization has been part of a rescue plan for SMEs during and after COVID-19 in Ontario. The third speaker for another 15 minutes is Professor Bertrand Valiorgue, who's Professor of Strategy and Corporate Governance at Clermont Auvergne University in France. His presentation is based on a collaborative research he's doing with two other colleagues, and it is based on a study of two private firms that transition to become cooperatives and the issues associated with this transition, specifically how executives decouple governance structure to prevent organizational democracy. So before we start, very briefly, remember that the speakers will be speaking for 15 minutes. I have a timer, and I will call the 5 minutes prior to the end. The timer will go off, so everyone will hear it. Keep the questions for the final element of our session together. Keep your microphone off, and remember that only 12 people can be seen at any single time during this session. So without further ado, I now pass it on to Patrizia. Professor Zanoni, thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you, Alessia, for organizing this, putting this together. Thank you for the colleagues to be part of this panel, and of course the people in the audience. I look forward to the questions. So let me share my presentation so we don't lose any time. Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, these are the conclusions. So I'm a professor of organization studies, trying to make sense of alternatives from the discipline of organization studies. And I want to share with you today my reflections on two cases of which are for me very groundbreaking and have made me think very differently about how can we move towards post-capitalist organizing of the economy and of society as a whole. So the discipline of organization studies has in the past 10 years, I would say, become more and more interested in alternatives. Coming from a tradition where the focus of our critical scholarship was rather critique of capitalism, we have been investing more and more in how we should, as scholars, support the emergence of alternatives to that capitalism. And so we have gone more and more interested into all kinds of alternative forms of organizing, ranging from cooperatives to grassroots organizing, or the notion, for example, of the commons. I would say in part this shift towards a more engaged, performative, and beyond critique kind of engagement with organizations has been triggered by the economic crisis of 2008, which has made the issue of inequality much more front stage in organization studies, even in the mainstream. I think triggering our shift in profiling ourselves as critical scholars, wanting to contribute to something that is not capitalism. Now, because we are organizational scholars, if you look at what kind of scholarship we have produced, you will see on alternatives, you will see that we are very much focused on alternative types of practices within organizations that to organize work, to organize property, to organize production and consumption, different types of relations between people, and of producing goods away from the private property model of the firm, hierarchy, and the production of commodities. So especially collective decision-making, horizontal organizational relations as opposed to vertical ones, characterizing firms, more equality, and of course, more solidarity. So the focus has been very much on this internal governance. And I would say the implicit, if not explicit, terms of comparison of alternatives remains for us the firm. So what we focus on in alternatives is often what is different from the firm. Now, of course, the more we become familiar with alternatives, the more we are able to see the difficulties that alternative forms of organizing experience to maintain themselves in the first place within a hegemonic capitalistic order, within existing institutions. And here I will say nothing probably surprising, but we are more and more recognizing that internal practices of governance that are understood to prefigure a post-capitalist future come under very strong pressures to conform to the existing order, leading to the temporary natures, for example, of many alternatives like grassroots organizations, but also demanding the scaling up of alternatives. Or studies have also recognized more and more the fact that maintaining alternatives is extremely demanding on people involved in them. It consumes them, their human resource, leading sometimes to cases of self-exploitation, and also pointing to the difficulty of sustaining mobilization of individuals over time. Now, this is, of course, not surprising in the sense that as Nancy Fraser teaches us, we should never take for granted the capacity, the available capacity for the social reproduction, our own social reproduction, to put into these alternatives. She draws attention to the fact that we should not treat ourselves as human resources or as a matter of fact, any natural resources as something taken for granted that is free and infinitely available and available to reproduce the alternatives, to experiment with the alternative. So she points to the dependency of these alternatives on resources from the environment within which they are embedded. Now, social reproduction theory is normally used to point to how capitalist firms depend on resources reproduced outside the process of capital accumulation, such as the domestic sphere, the services provided by the welfare state, but also natural resources. And similarly, if you look at alternatives as part of a bigger systems rely on a series of institutions in which they are embedded. For example, local states, families, other alternative organizations such as the commons, associations, even firms that might provide resources to these alternatives. So this boundary that we draw in organization studies around the alternative in order to focus on the internal governance mechanisms somehow detract attention from the institutional embeddedness of alternative within a capitalistic order, and also turn away attention from the necessity of the alternative to be institutionally transformative in order to remain in existence. So I think in the last few years, what we see is a shift from the discussion of governance practices, internal ones, towards the broader political project that needs to be part of the political project of alternative organizations, and with a clear ambition also to impact existing institutions, and also with a much stronger awareness of the dependence of alternative organization on institutions that are not necessarily alternative. In fact, they might be capitalist or in some way shaped by the capitalist order, like the state, the capitalist state, or families as reproducers of labor for the market and the capitalist economy. So this re-embedding alternative organization within a broader order is right now, I would say, very high on the agenda, because awareness has grown about the necessity to do so in order to trigger longer-term transformation. So I would say that this could be translated actually as into an awareness that we need to shift our analysis from the political micro practices within to the conditions of possibility for these practices to remain, emerge, flourish, and transform. Very much aware of the political economic order within of which these conditions of possibility are part. So I have two cases that I would like to briefly touch upon, which have, yes, I have a couple of slides. One case is a case of a cooperative of and for precarious project workers in the creative sector. And this is a work with Marianne de Koster, still in process, and in which we analyzed the kind of political practices used by this organization to reduce the precarity of their self-employed members. And we find actually two internal types of practices which redefine relationships within the group of the project workers, and two types of political practices that actually explicitly attempt to change institutions within which the cooperative is embedded. So the first two are definitely a democratic type of governance and conviviality within, which we see in many cooperatives, and also a system of mutualization of risks and resources in order to reduce individual risks of these creative workers, which works very well, and which also we find in many cooperatives. What is more specific of this case is the fact that the cooperative employs many of these project workers as employees, and through this employment secures coverage by the Belgian welfare state in terms of, for example, unemployment benefits and social security protection. This is one part. And the second part is the very proactive and very sustained political work to lobby for better protection of project workers within the Belgian social security system. And this here you see really a very clear going beyond the classical, I would say, ambition of cooperatives, not only to survive and be alternatives, but really to change the very notion of what is the welfare state and who should be protected by it. So you see a very successful case here of reduced precarity and protection, yet also two very explicit tensions. One tension is a reliance on the welfare state without, however, completely aligning with the requirement of the welfare state to contribute into the social security system as other employees and employers contribute. And so also creating at the political level a tension and a clear conflict at some points. And secondly, in terms of the potential to transform the subjectivity of this worker, we observe in this case that project workers remain very much wedded to their individual entrepreneurial project. And in that sense, we miss an evolution towards a more collective type of subjectivity, which you would expect in a long-term political project. The second and last case is even further, I would say, from the classical examples of alternative, because it's about the state attempting to collectivize social reproduction activities that normally are borne by individuals in families and often, more often, by women. And here you see the Belgian state setting up a voucher, a domestic service voucher scheme to reduce the precarity of domestic workers by creating a heavily subsidized system where they are employed by third parties, either social profit or for profit, and they work for client through an employer, and where the state provides all kinds of social protection and insurance and social security. It's a very successful team, and I would say very, very controversial. You will have some progressive thinkers really hating these schemes and others really defending it. I really see a lot of promise in the collectivization of reproductive tasks through the public subsidies. Also taking out domestic work from the informal economy is extremely important for the protection of these workers. Also, the users are not only rich people, it's quite diffuse as a tool to buy domestic services, and it enhances women's employment of all socioeconomic strata. Of course, this remains very heavy work. Yeah, I will close here. And so there are some contradictions to this. So here, perhaps just one final thought. From these cases, I think what I learned from these cases is that we need to look at the political economy of alternatives more than at the internal dynamics. Sorry for being too long.
Thank you so much, Patrizia. Without further ado, Marcelo, please. Your turn. And for those who have questions for Patrizia, thank you very much. Post your questions on the Q&A. Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you so much, Patrizia, and thank you, Alessia. Okay, I had a really colorful PowerPoint, but I won't be able to show it. So if you want to see my PowerPoint, I'd be happy to send it to you. So today's talk from me is about converting companies to cooperatives, actually existing pathways to democratizing work. Democratizing work is already happening around the world, and so the idea is to emulate it, make it nourish, and make it flourish. But there are varied possibilities for systemic change, depending on what kind of conversion to a cooperative or what kind of democratizing work you're doing. And I teach on this and spend many weeks talking to students about this. When we talk about democratizing work by converting companies to cooperatives, I want to focus on this, converting companies to cooperatives. There's three major pathways. The first pathway is a labor conflict recuperation. And this is what happens in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and parts of Europe, where there is a reaction by workers to actually the closure of firms, to some sort of macro or microeconomic crisis, how macroeconomic crisis lives and radiates onto shop floors. That I call a labor conflict recuperation, and I cover that in my, let me just see if I can, I'll send you via the chat, I will send you, in my book, which you can see there, on Argentina's empresas recuperadas por sus trabajadores, worker self-management in Argentina. I discuss at length and through 15 years of research and case study research how this labor conflict recuperation occurs in one country, Argentina. Second type is negotiated conversions, and we see this in Italy, France, Spain, and Quebec, and Canada as well. And I'm currently involved in a project where we're mapping out business conversions to cooperatives in Canada. It's called the Conversion to Cooperative Project, or Co-op Convert, and I'll send you the website through the chat. And I've also done work on this in Italy, on worker buyouts in Italy with Utrecht. And this work, I'm happy to say, had some influence. At least it's been cited by Italian legislators and even European Union legislators. And so I'm really happy about that. And so we tracked and mapped, I didn't send you my Italy, what we did was we mapped and tracked worker buyouts through the Legge Marcora model. This is an institutionalized model. It's a negotiated form in Italy. And we tracked all of the instances of these worker buyouts and did an analysis, and I came up with several publications on that. We're currently in the work that I'm doing in the Co-op Convert project in Canada, using the same methodology, multi-method approach to track conversions to co-ops in Canada. And that's really interesting, another negotiated conversion model. The third model is what I call partial conversions. These are conversions of firms where there is either co-ownership of the firm by workers or by stakeholders, but not necessarily decision-making rights, or decision-making rights, but not necessarily ownership rights. And so one example are ESOPs. ESOPs is an example of a partial conversion. I call it partial. For me, a full conversion is where workers or the community, the stakeholders in the firm have either have both at the same time ownership of the firm and also control the firm in the sense that they can make decisions. This to me is a full conversion. Now you can get there by the workers taking charge or the community taking charge and firing the boss, as in Argentina, so to speak, which is a labor conflict conversion, I call it. Or you can do it through negotiated processes, through legislation, through already existing frameworks, as you find in Italy, in France, and in Canada. Okay, so I want to focus today on, with the limited time I have, I want to focus today on two types. The labor conflict type and briefly, because I cover this in my book and I'll send you my PowerPoint, and also the negotiated type as reflected in Canada. I know Alessia has done work in Italy as well. And then the question here is how radical are these spaces in the sense of, do they reform the capitalist system or transform it? Do they reform the capitalist firm or transform it? What degrees of conversion happen in each? I argue that the Argentine model, the labor conflict model, you see a more kind of deeper conversion and more prefigurative possibilities. But at the same time, is it always relegated to crises? Do you have to rely on crises on the shop floor to make these more kind of radicalized conversions happen? And also, what my research has shown is that the change of consciousness of the workers into more democratic and participatory forms of engaging in these democratic firms tends to happen when there's deep crisis and when they have to struggle through this crisis together as a collectivity. I call this learning through struggle, learning in struggle, and I've done work on this as well. I've published on this. But do we only have to rely on struggle or crisis in order to have these changes happen? Or can we reform, convert firms in other ways that don't require such struggle and such battles against the system and against bosses, right? So can consciousness at a more macro level emerge amongst the working class from these experiences of these micro struggles and takeovers of factories? I argue that the more that people know about these experiences, the more that it will generate more experiences like this. So yes, but we can access these spaces in less crisis-riddled ways. But we need to communicate. We need to tell the world about these possibilities. The current pandemic has shown a moment where it's a moment of crisis where the very system itself is put into jeopardy. And so I think it's a perfect moment to look at why can't the system deliver masks? So, in the early stages, the system couldn't deliver masks, nor could it deliver, in Canada, toilet paper to most people and other things. Why is this? And so what does this say about new possibilities? Is that my time?
It is.
Jeez, I haven't even started. So let me just say that my work, I'll wrap it up. My work in Argentina looked at the social innovations that are created by over 400 worker recuperated enterprises that emerged because of and after the crisis in 2001, and they still emerge. And there's a long history in Argentina of workplace democracy, of cooperation, and of strong unionism. And this is where these emerge. So there's a context, there's a historical context in Argentina, which is why they happen in Argentina, or why they happen to this degree, to this radical degree. They still emerge, they're still present, and now it's become an institutional way of saving a firm from crisis. In Canada, in these negotiated conversions, they tend to be about succession issues. It tends to be because business owners are getting older, and there's a big swath of baby boomers that will be retiring, and so they don't know what to do with the firms. We just completed a representative survey of SME owners in Canada and asked them, what are your retirement intentions? Well, most of them, this is telling, many SME owners do not want to retire because they can't retire. So they want to keep on working. About 50% of them want to keep on working, but they don't want to have the same responsibility. Yeah. Another big portion of them want to retire, but they don't know where to sell their businesses to, and they have no family to sell it to. So in both of these situations, there's a possibility of selling it to the community or to owners. And we've been documenting cases across Canada of converted grocery stores, architectural firms, ambulance sector in Quebec, the funeral sector in Quebec, newspapers that have been converted to cooperatives, but in a negotiated manner, where the owner sells to the community or to the workers. And finally, just to say that there's multiple ownership models that can happen around these cooperatives. The most promising to me are worker co-ops, of course, but multi-stakeholder ownership models, where it's not only the producers, the workers that are part owners, but also the community. So it falls into the principle of the most affected, right? So for those that are most affected by the production and by the economic product production that's going on, those are the ones that have to be in charge and take responsibility over these firms. Mm-hmm. So I hope I haven't gone too much over, and thanks for the time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Now we move on to Bertrand. Thank you. Actually, it marries nicely with a French case. So take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Alessia, for inviting me to join this panel. This is, as you just said, directly related to what we are doing with two colleagues. So I'm working on corporate governance, and I started corporate governance with Cooperative in the field of agricultural cooperatives. And then with my fellows, we decided to move on, and we continue on agricultural cooperative, but we wanted to have a look on worker cooperatives. And we contacted the French National Association of Worker Cooperatives, and we asked them, we would like to have 5 private organizations, private firms, moving to cooperatives. So if I take your taxonomy, Marcelo, it is a negotiated conversion. It means it is in France, we have exactly the same phenomena. We have old owners, baby boomers, and the children, they do not really want to continue and to take the lead on firms. And these leaders, these owners, they decide to sell the company to workers and create worker cooperatives. So we started the French National Association, helped us to find 5 cases. We did not intervene in the process. So we asked for 5 and we had 5. And with this panel of 5 private firms moving to worker cooperatives, 2 of them, it was really difficult. Really difficult, with many tensions. And we had a great opportunity to observe, to meet executives, to meet directors, to meet workers inside these 2, what we call fake worker cooperatives or spurious worker cooperatives. And what we wanted to observe more precisely, so in our case, we adopt a macro perspective. We try to understand how the corporate governance structures evolved or did not evolve. And we focused on 3 structures: the board of directors, the general assembly, and the executive committee. And we wanted to understand, as I said, it was not really failures. At the beginning, we thought it was 2 cases of failure, but I think it's more complicated than that. But we wanted to understand the role played by executives. What did they do, these executives? Because, in fact, they prevented the spread of the organizational democracy deliberately. And we wanted to observe what did they do at the level of the governance structure. And we identified 3 practices in terms of corporate governance. Maybe the first one is the General Assembly disempowerment. It means, as you know, in worker cooperatives, the General Assembly is the place where democracy is in action. It's the place where you elect directors. It is a place where you can contest strategic choices or strategic decisions taken by the executives. And in the 2 cases, we observe that this General Assembly has been deliberately disempowered. It means that trivial questions during meetings. It means pressure on employees and on associates when they ask questions. It means that executives, they deliberately talk about trivial issues and not strategic ones. So in the 2 cases, what is supposed to be the core of democracy in worker cooperatives, the General Assembly, is downplayed, is disempowered. At the second level, inside the board of directors, which is here also, when you construct the governance of worker cooperatives, you are supposed to have in the board of directors counter power. It means here you have to, if they have to be directors, they have to be able to contest choices taken by executives. But inside these 2 boards of directors, there were only executives and maybe 2 simple workers, simple associates inside the board of directors. So the executives are also the directors, which, as you can understand here, there is a big problem. We think that there is a big problem because directors are supposed to act as counterpower to executives, but in fact, directors in our 2 cases, they were also the executives. And the third practice that we observed that is also, we think, problematic for the governance of worker cooperatives is executive entrenchment, which here, executive entrenchment, it means that executives, they try to increase the dependence on their social capital, on their human capital, on their activities in order to be not removed, in order to be inescapable in the functioning of the 2 cooperatives. So this is what we are currently observing in these 2 cases, and we are working on a model of fake democracy in true cooperatives, because the 2 cooperatives are formally worker cooperatives. They have the French status of worker cooperatives. The owners are workers, but so you have a kind of what we call a kind of decoupling because if you legally they are really cooperatives, but in practice, when you observe the functioning of the governance, we clearly observe in our two cases that the democracy is deliberately prevented. And maybe to conclude on these two cases, we are working on that. We have not published yet. We are working with my two fellows on that. I would like to say that at the beginning, we started to think that executives were cynical, or executives wanted to keep the power in their hands, and that we were in a case of classical managerial entrenchment, where executives, they want to keep the power because it's good for their wages, it's good for their social status, and they were in this kind of strategy, personal strategies. But I think it's more complex than that, because the two worker cooperatives, the habitus or the way of functioning, for a long time, they were private companies. So they didn't have the competencies. They didn't have the knowledge. They didn't have the experience. And they didn't know how to govern a worker cooperative. They don't understand what is a board of directors. They did not understand what is the role of a board of directors in practice. They did not really understand the potential of a general assembly. So we moved from a cynical perspective, from a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. And here we think that the French National Association of Worker Cooperatives play a strange role, and I mean an ambiguous role, because they are supposed to, they provide the model, of worker cooperatives, but they don't really give insights and clear guidelines regarding the governance. So it's not really a surprise if these two new worker cooperatives, if the executives had troubles to identify how to govern these new worker cooperatives, because they have not been trained, they don't have really the knowledge, and in the end, this leads to spurious worker cooperatives. But no cynicism. Maybe there is cynicism, but at one stage there is also a lack of knowledge. So this is what I wanted to share with you, my colleagues, and thank you, Alessia, for joining me, for adding me on this panel, because this is very close to what we try to do, and I'm really happy to share this and respond to your question, and maybe to the community which has joined us on this day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually impressed that we managed to finish even before the time allocated to each of you, which really speaks to your care and attention. So thank you very much. I think now one of the what we could do, and I hope we have 20 people attending, so it would be really good if we could open up to questions and comments from those who chose to participate with us today to discuss the different ways of understanding processes of democratizing work and the dilemmas and issues associated with it that our colleagues today have shared with us from these different experiences. I have, quite a few questions from my fellow colleagues, but of course, I'm very happy to, as a chair, I need to obviously open up to the floor. So please, anyone who has questions, I see that there is, Marcelo has already answered some questions from Sam. But I think there is still one that it is here. So Sam, do you want to answer? Sorry, do you want to ask your question? And I think our support should be able to enable you to unmute yourself and also give you the opportunity to open your video so that we can actually see you. If you want to do that, of course. If you just want to do it without showing your video, that's fine. Thank you.
Oh, hello. Hey.
Hey. Hi.
Thank you all for your research and your presentations. I am familiar enough with the political and cultural challenges of working together in cooperatives, and especially in converting the culture and processes of an SME or a for-profit company into a cooperative. All those social dynamics and procedural dynamics and institutional dynamics seem incredibly challenging to me. One that has shown up outside of those conversations in a number of the worker cooperative conversion attempts that I've been familiar with has been the challenge of finding financing to pay the previous shareholders or previous SME owner of the business to buy the assets of the business and turn them over to the worker owners who will now be the responsible parties for that financing or for that credit. And I'm just trying to figure out, like, how big a problem is that relative to the cultural components and the procedural components and so on. If we had to say obviously they're both important, but if we had to say, one of them is what is holding back, the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, like, there are some things that are holding back more than other things. It is finding financing what is keeping us from having 100 experiments instead of 10, or is it the other way around? It's that 100 experiments aren't happening because the cultural and political dynamics and procedural dynamics are so difficult that the financing isn't that big a factor in the number of conversion attempts that we're having right now. Does that question make sense?
Yes, thank you very much, Sam. Can I ask you, where are you speaking from, Sam?
Sure, I'm in Durham, North Carolina.
Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, this is a great question. I have quite a few ways to answer this, but of course, I first of all ask my the member of the panel to please provide their understanding of how they would address this question. Thank you. Whoever wants to speak, please go ahead.
I'll start, because the question wasn't initially posed to me. It's a chicken and egg question in many ways. Do more conversions not happen because there's not an awareness of them, or because there's not financing of them? Well, yeah, both at the same time, and that's why it's complicated. There isn't as much of an awareness of them. There isn't an awareness of them in, for example, Canada. There's only 200 that we've tracked. And so they don't, workers that could buy out factories or workplaces, or owners that could sell, don't do it because they don't know how. And then if they want to do it, they don't know where to go. It's really complicated. It's like, where do they go? Well, we have co-op developers in Canada, and we have business valuators and accountants that know how to do this, but there's no there's no one-stop shop. So there's also not a consciousness, participatory democratic consciousness. Paul Bernstein talks about this as one of the 6 necessary elements of workplace participation. On the other hand, there's also very little financing, and workers, especially workers without a history of investment, or with just their house to put up as collateral, aren't considered subjects of credit, as they say in Argentina. We're not subjects of credit, therefore. It's the same thing in Canada and elsewhere. So there's a finance issue. How do you buy out a firm? It's complicated, right? How do you buy out a firm, especially if it's capital intensive? Well, the traditional co-op sector in some countries have figured this out to some degree. So Italy, I think, is one amongst the most advanced countries here. But so Spain, and to some degree France too. But in Italy, there's multiple ways that workers can actually get money to buy out a firm, and it's legislated. Part of it is legislated. Part of it is money from the national coffers.
Yeah.
So this is called the Legge Marcora framework, and there are soft loans and grants at the same time that are administered by the cooperative movement and an institution that's both co-owned by the cooperative movement and the Ministry of the Economy in Italy. Yeah. It's called CFA. It's called CFI.
Yeah.
But secondly, the cooperative movement itself has money to give. So all Italian cooperatives have to give 3% of their pre-tax revenues or profits back to the cooperative sector. Well, the cooperative sector then uses this to finance new co-ops and buyouts and that. And there's also other multiple ways of doing it that is institutionalized in Italy that's not so in Canada or the US, right? So this is the trick. But what happens in Italy? Well, in Italy, there's a long tradition of cooperativism, and cooperativism linked to the development of the Italian state as well. So anyway, in our countries, in the US and Canada, there's less so, although there's still mechanisms, but they're not as clear. It's just harder to get financing. Sorry, Alessia.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that to me, that answer very much depends on the different conjuncture where one is actually speaking from. In other words, that it is the specificity of the political economy and the institutional embeddedness of the various organizations and opportunities that are available. So as you pointed out, the situation is very different in Canada from what happens in Italy, from what happened and then, in many ways transitioned in Argentina, right? Because Argentina changed dramatically, from the empresas that were occupied first to then being, moving really the institutional terrain quite significantly, and a new constitution of legislation and opportunities were created after those original ways in which there was the labor conflict that generated the empresa recuperadas, right? So in many ways, I think, Sam, the question is very much, it depends on where you're speaking from and what kind of conditions. As Patrizia said at the beginning, that question literally is fundamental to answer any kind of potential experimentations. In other words, what are the specific conditions where something like that you are talking about? In other words, what kind of experimentation can we have in these new forms, in these new conversions? What is possible? It depends on the institutional terrain and the opportunities that are there present. So in a place like Italy, yes, you have a different history. You have a certain notion of work, for example, that is even inscribed in the constitution. That is very different from the US. You know what I mean? Yeah. There is a financial infrastructure that, as Marcelo said, has been put into place. But let us be clear, still, we are talking very, very small numbers in relation to the opportunities that are there. Yeah. So the institutional opportunities and possibilities, they do not mean that even if there is a finance, that we have enough work, which could be institutional entrepreneurship, it can be institutional work, whatever way you want to look at it, right? That makes possible the constitution or the multiplication of the experimentation. So there is that element of what Marcelo was talking about, which is the learning, the change of the attitudes, to use Bertrand's view, that really has to happen. In other words, it is the political work that Patrizia was talking about. And without that, we are never going to be able to construct our subjectivity able to actually build and reproduce those kind of organizations, right? And we find the case of Bertrand, or we find the cases of the much more, if you like, worse situation of the cynicism through which the false cooperatives are utilized right now, also in Italy, you know what I mean? Where it is a massive phenomenon, unfortunately, that is creating a lot of problems, right? So I think it is great that we are having this conversation. To me, at least, it's fantastic that I see all of you and so many of you are actually in business schools, because how can we do all that work that we people are supposed to actually educate people to enter workplaces and educate them to organize and to manage? are not even, don't even have the knowledge, right, to actually educate our students, yeah, because the only model that we know about or that we use in our courses and in our university is the traditional one, the hierarchical sort of traditional forms of governance, to use Bertrand's sort of framework and so on. So I think this is, this kind of institutional political lens is fundamental to your question. Thank you very much, Sam. I would like to move on now to another question that was in the Q&A. Patrizia, if that's okay, I give precedence to Matthew. Thank you. I would like, please, Matthew, to be given rights to speak and to show himself. Thank you, Sam, again. I don't know if this is happening or not.
Yeah, but again, Matthew's question goes back to education, it seems, and the knowledge of these models amongst oh,
Matthew, there we go.
Average person. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I've got really bad internet, so I did miss a lot of the talks, unfortunately, and certainly, I mean, Marcelo was just mentioning some of the things that I was kind of hinting at, and it can see in some of the chats which I'm just reading back on, this kind of obviously being discussed, so I don't want to kind of dwell too much on it, but yeah, it's a problem in the UK. Co-ops UK, which is the kind of main cooperative body, just really isn't that interested in and that knowledgeable of work at co-ops. I think that's fair to say, and people have been trying to challenge that, but it's been a real issue, and without that, as you seem to be saying, in Canada, you just don't have that kind of institutional support. But I was just interested in hearing about different perspectives from different countries and different places, and ideas about how to kind of navigate that problem, which is huge.
Let me just say quickly. Let me just say that in Quebec, it's different. Quebec does have much more knowledge. There's much more widespread knowledge. They have what are called really innovative regional cooperative development regions. And so in each region, there's a one-stop shop where you can go to and find out everything you want to know about co-ops, and they'll tap you into funding. And the funding is also linked to labor funds as well in Quebec. So the labor movement is really involved in creating co-ops. This is another space where, in places in Italy where there's dense cooperative economies, like Emilia-Romagna, you also have supportive unions, but it's not uniform in Italy. Yeah, and institutionally in Argentina, it was workers originally did this out of crisis, out of like no other desperation. There's no other work available, so we have to save our machines in our shops. But eventually, the workers themselves organized with unions in different ways and changed the institutions and the laws themselves through organizing. So the use of expropriation law in Argentina, with the argument that either we were massively unemployed and the state pays us unemployment insurance, or you allow us to work. Good argument. We'll allow you to work. So use the firm in usufruct and we'll expropriate it out of a public good because there's so massive unemployment. And this is how they won that argument in legal spaces. Interesting, Peter Ranes, who's a colleague of Alessia, a colleague of ours who's done work on this from the States, he's proposed use of eminent domain in the States. Eminent domain law in the States is expropriation law. Mm-hmm. So municipalities have used it to, and states have used it to expropriate spaces. So why not use it to expropriate workplaces and have, if these are saving jobs, there is an argument to be made that public money could be used into facilitating. So, and it's not massively, this is not fantasy. In Canada, in the fishing sector, to tide fisher folk over between seasons, because they don't work all the time, they use unemployment insurance. Mm-hmm. It's an already existing mechanism of the state to tide these workers over between seasons. And it's a legitimate way of running the fishery sector in Canada without using more money. It uses unemployment insurance. So why not do innovate, like look at different existing pieces of legislation and use it creatively like that?
Thank you. I would, I mean, I don't know if Patrizia and Bertrand would like to intervene, please.
Yeah, maybe, I think sorry.
Go ahead, Patrizia. Continue.
I just want to say that in COP, that's what happens, right? See, what Marcelo, what you now say, you use some welfare state to tie up individuals into something collective, which, however, creates also some contradictions and tensions because that tool wasn't devised for that. Yes. Yeah, and especially when the system is very generous. I think the less generous the system, the less tension, of course. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. Bertrand?
Yeah, just one point regarding the attitude of unions in France. And what we have discovered is very interesting, because they are French unions are not fond of worker cooperatives. They don't really want to open this path. And what we observe in one case is that one union, which is very strong in France, so they wanted to sell the company, and the worker cooperatives, it was a project at this stage, and the union contacted a competitor to ask to buy the company because they didn't want to start a worker cooperative. So unions in that very case, specific case, they were deliberately and clearly against the worker cooperative project. So this was for us when we started and when we observed this, it was a great surprise to see the very ambiguous position of French unions. And we don't have in France, the cooperative movement is dominated by very large cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, as I said, cooperatives in finance. And this is, how can I say that? They are not really innovative. They do not promote new ideas in terms of governance. So there is a strong domination of large players, and they do not push for worker cooperatives at the size of SMEs. So the national movement is not fond of worker cooperatives.
Can I build on this? I think the situation is in many ways similar in Italy. The case we studied, actually, the union wasn't averse to it, but of course, when you have the conversion and the transition to workers buyout, when it happens, is usually, as Marcelo was saying, is either due to a crisis because of a shutdown, right? And in Italy, just like in France, there is this kind of, immediate attempt by the union to do what? First of all, to make sure that the workers can use all the social nets that is present in Italy. So, immediately going to get what? Cassa integrazione and all the systems that are there to support the workers to keep the wage, right? Some form of wage, number one. Number two, immediately is to start a negotiation with the owners through the government to do what? To sell the company and to open it up again with the new owners. I mean, this is the way, right? That's the kind of immediate. This is the path. This is the if you like the structures. This is the kind of path dependency. This is what these organizations are designed to do. That's what they do, and. The workers' buyout is literally calling for a different type of system where everyone has to embody a different kind of actor and has to enact a different type of actor using different practices that, frankly, they are neither used to, they have little knowledge of, and they really, in many ways, are shaping the system in a way that is a little bit problematic. So let us remember that the cooperatives in themselves are already incorporated in the capitalist system. So there is always that tension in these systems, right? And therefore, anything that is somewhat changing that, because when you create a subject, there is not deciding, but literally moving from being a dependent into an entrepreneur into is a completely different ballgame, which is different from choosing to get in a cooperative because that's the only way that is available in that particular location. Do you see what I mean? The transition is bigger, it's huge.
But it's not only mental, it's not only cultural.
No.
You become capital in a way.
Absolutely. And and there are systems. That's the point. There are systems available, but there are also a lot of resistances. That's my point. There are a lot of resistances to this. And that's why, to go back to Matthew's question, I think that the process that we are seeing is a number of agencies. For example, actually, there was a panel running parallel to us today, which is actually of a social organization, an association that has created a kind of platform to support workers' buyout in Italy, right? Because as Marcelo was saying, even in a place where there is a lot of institutional support, still those things are not activated, are not enacted, that are not the practices. People are not doing them, and people don't know about it. So there is a counter movement that is happening, building more awareness, more knowledge, and making that knowledge more available to different actors who can use these practices, right?
Can I also say in Italy that there's the contradictions are really deep because yes, workers in Italy that are going to be unemployed because a company is closing can use their unemployment insurance, future use of unemployment insurance to buy out the firm. Okay, that's one innovative form of funding. Yeah. However, what happens in Italy is when they go into their unemployment insurance schemes, I don't know if it's changed, Patrizia and Alessia, you might be, in 2015, the unemployment laws changed in Italy, but it used to be, I think it's the same, they go into these lists. If you're a regulated worker, right, you go into a list, and then if your firm opens up again, they have to hire you back. And new company or companies that are hiring workers have to first go to these lists of unemployed workers to hire people. And so that kind of, okay, well, a worker will go, well, should I take a risk and be an owner of a firm, a co-owner of a firm, or should I just go on this list, take the cassa integrazione, and then wait until I get a job again, which isn't, it's not, up until a few years ago, it was, you could live off of that to some degree in Italy, plus with your family, social safety net, and all the other things, right? You could foreseeably, so it was actually a counterproductive to the creation of the very co-ops that the Italian system was kind of trying to promote. So this is where the system is now in contradiction with these kind of more democratic forms of, and probably, to be critical, why the system allows worker buyouts to happen. Why the system allows work, because it's not really a threat to the capitalist system. I mean, to be really critical. Yeah. And so as long as it's not a threat, then this is another option. It's one more stopgap. And so you don't want, upset workers, because then you have what happened in Argentina. They want to take over.
That's the contradiction, right? You want to a post-capitalist system, but in that phase, you become actually capital in. Not completely, not internally, but in the political economy, you become capital. Yeah. So I think the unions are in a very difficult place here. And I'm very wary of, speaking badly about the unions, because they're not stupid. They know the workers very well. I mean, Bertrand, when you say, the executives keep them hostage, I mean, this is the typical situation where a union doesn't want to be, right? So you have a cooperative, but all the knowledge you need to function as a cooperative is in the hands of a few executives. So if you are a cooperant, you don't fall under all this legislation. You can, in principle, not even be represented by a classical trade union. So, I mean, then you have nothing. So I think, I'm very, I'm very but I'm also very sensitive to what is happening here in terms of the political economy, who's assuming the risk, and can you carry that risk? And of course, you need to push the boundaries of what we know. obviously, otherwise we wouldn't have this conversation. But, you know, also understanding what it means for those that are really the weakest in socioeconomic terms, or in cultural and social network, or, you know, tradition. And I don't know, I think this is the tension that we see in this cooperative, for example, very clearly in this debate between, you know, the wage model with the welfare state that really protects, and on the other hand, becoming yourself a new form of capital, if you want, that is cooperative capital.
Yeah, in Argentina, there's the co-op workers are trying to change this legislation. Cooperative members are known as autonomous workers, as self-employed, so they don't even fall. This is the big struggle. It has been over the past few years. They don't even fall within the rights of workers, of dependent workers.
Yeah,
under contract. They're all self-managed. They're all self-employed workers.
Yeah.
So it's like, and I think, and I'm just speculating here. I'm thinking ahead. I haven't done any deep thinking or research about this, but I think perhaps the most progressive spaces for really turning over the system might be gig economy workers organizing under cooperatives. Now here you have precarious workers that come together, right, to defend their rights and to, you know, be strong, increase their strength in a collective, that are at the cutting edge of where capitalism is going. Mm-hmm. And in 0-hour contracts, you know, gig economy. So you're all entrepreneurs now. So when they're organizing into cooperatives, it's interesting that they tend to be more radicalized. I don't know. This is from what I'm starting to understand. They're coming at it from, rather than seeing dependent workers that are threatened with unemployment, that have these social safety nets. Maybe these are the more radical spaces now in the global north. Anyway, the global south has known about precarious work for a long time, but in the global north, especially amongst the Uber delivery people, and all of this kind of gig economy. I don't know. I just want to put that out there. That maybe these are the radical spaces now.
I agree with you. I think that is a space of precarity, right? And what Patrizia is showed us, that there are different ways through which that kind of those systems of work are currently, in many ways, starting to be incorporated, but at the same time, certain opportunities offered, and also rights and support offered to those workers is very much one of the frontiers of where we are at in terms of work and opportunities. And at the same time, to me, is very much something. The frontier is also very much dependent on not only on the conditions of work, because, as I said, I think there are quite a few examples. I'm just going back to the Italian example, quite a few examples of what you would call kind of militant workers buyout, right? So there is also that. In other words, there's not a kind of pacified only, if you like, the pacified vision of it, where the worker is somewhat sort of colonized and incorporated through this new system, is just a partial version of it, because actually there are these other more militant versions of workers buyout. They themselves know where the frontier is, and they are trying to build that frontier very clearly. And this is what those people that I was talking about earlier, are trying to do. So recuperating, if you like, all those versions of the solidaristic economy that, Marcelo, we saw quite significantly in Argentina, right? Where there was that kind of mode of action towards a different kind of solidaristic economy that would try to move in practice in a post-capitalist manner, right? So I think those tensions and that kind of openness in the debate, which is the political debate, is also very clear at work right now in a place like Italy. So I don't think it's a complete, pacified and completely incorporated sort of arena. Yeah, just to be fair to those workers who are really at the forefront of the political debate of how to democratize work.
The most promising spaces in Argentina, for example, are the ones that where workers have taken over their workplaces, and because of the support they received for the community, because of their consciousness raising that happened in this transformation, and I document this in my book, where they take on community support and solidarity. So giving a portion of their revenues for community development, where the state isn't present, they become present. Opening up the shop to the community. So they call this in Argentina la fábrica abierta, or the open factory. Yeah. So we're in the capitalist system where everything has to be kept secret and the walls are impenetrable, and it closes at 5 o'clock and nobody uses the space over the weekend. In Argentina, they use the space all the time. In the most radical spaces, they use the space all the time. So they're not just producing widgets, whatever they do during the workday, but they also produce culture. Yeah. They open up the space for rec centers, for free health clinics, for an interesting movement that emerged in Argentina is a K-12 equivalency adult education, and actually K-12 education too, where people that in marginalized communities where they couldn't get their high school equivalency, they can do so through the bachilleratos populares, or popular high schools. Mm-hmm. So this emerged from the empresas recuperadas, mm-hmm. in the most radical ones that emerged. So those to me are really promising, and sure. Embracing the kind of democratic work and kind of socializing it beyond the factory. That's so promising out of these initiatives.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, those are very important examples, and I think it goes back to what some of the experiences that are happening in Italy, and I also and the many examples that happen constantly and have been happening for a long time in the global south, right? So I think that's really exactly this notion that these experiences are happening already and they have been happening. So this I think is important always to sort of remember, to go back to the various notions that there are different forms manifesting in different places at all time, and and I think that is helpful in many ways, and it gives us a little bit of hope, at least to me. Bertrand, Patrizia, just opening up to you and your
No, well, I think we covered quite some important aspects actually of the contradictions, the promise, but also the contradiction of working through cooperatives towards something that is different from capitalism. I think what I remember from one of the articles on these empresas recuperadas, and you mentioned this, Marcelo, this crisis, and the crisis, we use it as a rhetorical tool to, prefigure the post-capitalist. You need a crisis to try to imagine, but it's not only that, right? In that case, it's really a crisis of your means of subsistence.
Yeah, right.
And then I think the cultural and the political economic kind of align, and then you have more, necessity, but also potential to enter in something different, because what really doesn't work, doesn't allow you to subsist. And maybe in a minor version of this is also when an owner retires, but it's not quite the same, right? If you are in a well-functioning labor market, maybe you have other alternatives, so it's already a more defensive kind of thing, I think. And then and then you can imagine something that really doesn't stay within the boundary of capitalism. What you're saying, the fábrica becomes abierta because you want to redefine that space not as a capitalist space, not only because it's democratically managed, because it kind of goes beyond the boundaries of the firm, basically. And I think these things, you know, are not all over the place. We say cooperative, but in another context, it doesn't mean the same thing, and we need to be very alert to that. And I'll stop here because I could go on and on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think Patrizia, thank you for that. I mean, the words, form of, you know, cooperativization, collaboration, mutuality, social enterprises. You know, there are many different ways through which these different forms, experiences, and experiments of you know, collaborative forms that are, you know, beyond traditional hierarchical and you know, top-down managerial sort of systems. That's why at the beginning I mentioned those experiences, you know, from Africa and so on, because I really wanted to recuperate, you know, the notion that we've been at it, you know, form of collaborative work that are different and not necessarily. They've been in parallel. Sometimes they'll be completely subsumed, sometimes not. Have been going on for a long time, and I just wanted to sort of remind ourselves of that, and also of how they've been silenced, and that's hence my reference to the African American, you know, management history. You know, that was very much based on cooperatives, you know, cooperative type of principle, not within the way we understand cooperative from a legal point of view. Are you with me? So again, it goes back to your point, Patrizia, that there are different ways of through which different forms of democratization can happen, and socialization of work within. Basically, that's what we're talking about, is a socialization of work and of relations in different forms that are not commodified. You know, so to basically to put it simply, right? You know, that's what we're talking about. Or basically, to put it sociologically rather than simply, I suppose. So I think I just want to open up to, so if anyone, we have a few minutes left. If anyone wants to have a final comment or question, please raise your hand from the chat. I thank all of you, because I see that there has been quite a lot of various discussions going on at once, which is always what happens when we have this online events, and the chat is available. So is there anyone?
So Sam is becomes more convinced by Mitbestimmung rather than COPs. No. We don't want to. We don't want to demoralize your you just, well, I guess Mitbestimmung has other kind of advantages, the German system, but I wouldn't call it post-capitalistic by any rate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is incorporated in the system, you know, in the German version of capitalism, right? So, you know, it is the way the, you know, neoliberalism has played out in the German state. Really, it's quite interesting, actually. But I mean, I suppose if I want to, you know, if I can say the final comment, and then please, you know, you all feel free to give your comment. I'm just very happy that we had this conversation, and that I hope that this is just the first of a global forum on democratizing work. I am super thankful to the organizers that put us together and created this space for us all. It's been amazing, and I just think that the question of how we democratize work and we decommodify work and decarbonize work is very significant. And in many ways, the notion of democracy is today at the center of everything that we are doing as academics and as scholars and as citizens. I think that question of democracy and the various ways through which the revolution of democracy, as we'll talk about it, right? It calls it this kind of revolution. I think that the revolution is currently very much been in many ways, we are seeing the counter-revolution in many different states. So, if there is a revolution I'm happy to fight for, is that. So, that revolution of deepening democracy and deepening democratic relations, to me, is definitely one worth fighting for. And this conversation shows that many people are actually willing and happy to still keep at it and keep on asking the questions of what that means and how we get it done in a better way than it is right now. Please, my panelists, your final words.
I just don't want to end with, there's no possibility of conversion. There is, I think that, but it requires, oh man, it's just within a few minutes, it's hard to express. But we have experiences of society's revolution, changing from the ground up. And I think that, for example, I live with a kernel in the US right now amongst the young, it's okay to talk about socialism. This is a huge advance forward. So going from mentioning socialism to mentioning, community and worker ownership is very close. So I think that we could be sitting on the cusp of something pretty radical, where more workplaces become democratic. I think this is part of the transformation of the Anthropocene, both environmental and also livelihood-wise. So I think there's hope.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you. Bertrand and Patrizia, the final words for all of us. Thank you.
I was happy to be here, and it was. I hope that it is not the first one, and there is a series of a forum on this issue. We are very few on working on conversion of cooperatives, and I would like to be happy to. I will be happy to continue and have conversations on that issue, because I think that this is an opportunity and a path to open new ways and in terms of governance and democracy. And I would be happy to continue this conversation on cooperativization or conversion.
Yeah, great. That's great. I'm also up for it. Patrizia? Am I going to say, unmute yourself?
No, the most cited.
The most cited.
No, yes. No, certainly. I think we need to keep the discussion going, and I think we need to be realistic, but also hopeful and imaginative. So certainly, Marcelo, I think we should not close the session saying, there is no alternative, right? There is an alternative. The hell there is. And I do think that you're right to point to the political moment. Never in our lifetime, I guess we're all around the same years, has it been so positive to talk about these issues. And that's why we are here today. I guess this is also the expression of this, right?
Yeah.
There is a boom, and we are going to push and do our own share of the work.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask those who participated today, if you are willing to continue the conversation, if you want to send me an email and with your name, and we can maybe build a list and see if we can use this as a way to then maybe continue the conversation somehow, maybe creating a little workshop, maybe, there are various ways through which academics and activists can always find a way to connect again. So please do so. My email is, well, you find it on, it was present there at the beginning of in the first screen, at the bottom of the screen, I think. I'm going to type it quickly. So it's alessia.contu@umb.edu. So Patrizia is also there. So feel free to send us the details, and we'll try to continue this conversation together. Thank you so much. Have a great day wherever you are, and thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you, Alessia, for putting it together.
Thank you, Alessia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye now. Bye.
Bye. Bye.